Welcome back, everyone. Glad you could join us for another deep dive. We got a really interesting book suggestion from one of you this time.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, The Myth of Left and Right by Verlan and Hyrum Lewis.
I've heard of that one.
Yeah, it's been making the rounds, and we figured, you know what? Let's tackle this head on, see what all the fuss is about, because it seems like every time you turn around these days, it's all left versus right, this side versus that side. And frankly, it's getting a little exhausting, right? So this book comes along saying, hey, hold on a second. What if those labels we're so obsessed with are actually part of the problem? So let's dive in and see if they're on to something, shall we?
Sounds good to me. I'm ready to have my assumptions challenged.
All right. So the first thing the authors do is really lay out this traditional way of seeing the political spectrum. The way most of us probably learned it,
Right, the sort of politics 101 version.
Yeah, exactly. You got your left wing over here, your right wing over there.
For each side with its own set of core values and principles.
Yeah. So like on the left, you've got things like equality, social justice, government intervention.
And on the right, it's more about tradition, individual liberty, free markets.
And it seems pretty straightforward at first glance.
Wow.
It's neat, it's tidy, it's how we make sense of the political landscape.
It's how we categorize candidates, how we choose sides in debates. But is it really that simple?
Well, that's exactly what the authors start poking at. They call this the essentialist view. And they argue it's essentially a myth.
A myth?
Yeah, because the problem is the essentialist view assumes that these categories, left and right, are fixed and unchanging.
Like fundamental laws of nature or something.
Right, like gravity. You're either on one side or the other, and that's that.
Yeah.
But the authors say, hey, hold on a minute. If you actually look at history, things get a lot more complicated, a lot more messy.
Because people change, parties evolve, and those neat categories we've created start to break down.
Exactly. And they give some pretty compelling examples.
Oh, yeah.
Well, one that really jumped out at me was the whole shift in conservative views on foreign interventionism.
That's a good one.
For decades, it was like a core principle of conservatism, right?
Yeah.
Limited government involvement overseas, America first kind of stuff.
Right.
And then, boom, George W. Bush comes along, and suddenly it's all about preemptive strikes and nation building.
And the same folks who were railing against big government at home were suddenly all for flexing American muscle abroad.
Yeah. And then, just as quickly, as soon as Bush is out of office, the whole thing flips again. Conservatives go right back to being skeptical of foreign entanglements.
It makes you wonder if these supposed core principles are as fixed as we think they are.
Right. So if it's not about these, essential principles, what's really driving our political affiliations and beliefs?
Good question. Well, the authors have a pretty thought-provoking answer to that.
Oh, what do they say?
They call it the social view of the political spectrum, and they argue that it's less about ideology and more about, well, tribalism.
Tribal.
Yeah, the need to belong, to fit in with a group. We adopt beliefs and positions, not necessarily because we've rigorously thought them through, but because they signal our loyalty to our chosen tribe.
So it's more about fitting in than figuring things out.
In a lot of cases, it seems like it. We align ourselves with a group, and then we adopt the beliefs that come with the membership package, so to speak.
Wow. I mean, that's kind of humbling, right? To think that our deeply held political beliefs might be more about our social circles than our individual reasoning.
Definitely makes you think twice. And they have some pretty interesting examples to back this up, too.
Oh, yeah, like what?
Well, one that stands out is the rise of the religious right in the U.S. back in the 1970s.
Right.
You had all these folks who, before that, weren't really that politically engaged. But then the issue of abortion became this huge flashpoint.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden, millions of people who primarily identified through their religious beliefs were swept into this conservative political movement.
It's almost like an entire political identity was formed around a single issue.
Yeah, and it raises this question, would those individuals have even considered themselves conservative if it weren't for that one specific issue?
Interesting. So it's like external events and social movements can really shape our entire political outlook.
Absolutely. And the book goes even further, citing research showing that people are more likely to adjust their views to align with their chosen political leaders rather than the other way around.
Really? It's like we're following the leader rather than thinking for ourselves.
It can definitely seem that way sometimes. It's like we're hardwired to prioritize belonging over independent thought, especially when it comes to politics.
So we've got this idea that our political categories are more fluid than we think. and that our affiliations are driven by tribalism more than ideology.
Right. It's a pretty radical departure from how we usually think about these things.
And the authors don't stop there. They go on to question the very tools we use to measure political ideology.
What do you mean, like polls and surveys and stuff?
Yeah, things like that. They
Yeah.
argue that a lot of these methods, especially the ones based on like congressional voting records, are kind of circular in their logic.
Circular how?
Well, they assume these fixed definitions of left and right, then use those definitions to categorize politicians' votes.
Which then reinforces the original assumptions.
Exactly. It's like saying, this politician votes this way, so they must be on the left because, well, that's how people on the left vote. It becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy.
So it's like we're trapped in the system where the categories are constantly being defined and redefined by the very people they're supposed to be categorizing.
It's like trying to nail jelly to a wall. It's just this constantly shifting target.
Makes you wonder if we're even measuring the right things in the first place.
Right. And this whole thing, this whole myth of left and right, it's not just some abstract academic debate.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, the authors argue it has real-world consequences for how we see each other, how we interact, how we function as a society.
And not in a good way, I'm guessing.
Not exactly. They argue that this essentialist thinking, this us versus them mentality, fuels a lot of the animosity, the distrust, and ultimately the inaction that we see in our political discourse today.
So it's not just that we have different opinions, it's that we see those who disagree with us as fundamentally wrong, maybe even dangerous.
Exactly. And that kind of shuts down any possibility of having a productive conversation, let alone finding common ground and solving problems together.
Yeah, it's like we've forgotten how to disagree without being disagreeable. We've lost the art of civil discourse.
And I think the book really nails it when it talks about how this myth leads to oversimplification. Like we reduce everything to these binary choices, left or right, good or evil, us versus them.
Right. It's like we can't handle nuance anymore. Everything has to fit into these neat little boxes.
And if something doesn't fit, well, we just force it in there anyway, even if it means distorting reality to fit our preconceived notions.
And that kind of black and white thinking, it makes it so much easier to demonize the other side.
Oh, yeah, totally. It's like once you've labeled someone as the enemy,
Yeah.
you don't even have to listen to their arguments anymore.
You've already decided they're wrong, maybe even malicious, just because they belong to the out group.
And that's when things get really dangerous, right? Because it's that kind of dehumanization that leads to prejudice, discrimination, even violence.
The book actually talks about this trend of ideological segregation, which is pretty concerning.
What's that?
It's the idea that we're increasingly sorting ourselves into these echo chambers where we only interact with people who share our political beliefs.
Oh, right, like choosing to live in certain neighborhoods or only watching news channels that reinforce our existing views.
Exactly. And it's happening online, too, big time.
Hmm.
Social media algorithms feed us content that aligns with our preferences, so we end up in these filter bubbles where we're never exposed to opposing viewpoints.
It's like we're creating these parallel universes where everyone agrees with us all the time.
Which might sound appealing at first.
Yeah, no more arguments.
Right. But the problem is, it creates this false sense of consensus.
And it reinforces our biases, makes us less tolerant of dissent, less willing to even consider the possibility that we might be wrong.
And that's really bad news for a democracy. Because a healthy democracy depends on citizens being able to engage in respectful debate, to weigh different perspectives, and to find compromise.
It's like if everyone's just shouting their own opinions from inside their own little echo chamber, how are we ever going to solve problems together?
Exactly. It's like trying to have a conversation with someone who's wearing noise-canceling headphones.
You're talking, but they're not really listening. And they're certainly not engaging with your ideas in any meaningful way.
And this lack of engagement, this inability to even acknowledge the validity of other perspectives, it leads to this erosion of trust.
We start to see each other as the enemy, not as fellow citizens who might just have different ideas about how to achieve the same goals.
And that's incredibly damaging to the fabric of society, because when we lose trust in each other, we lose faith in our institutions, and ultimately we lose faith in the whole system.
It's a vicious cycle, isn't it? The more divided we become, the harder it is to find common ground, and the more entrenched we become in our own beliefs.
So what do we do about it?
That's the million-dollar question, right? Well, luckily, the authors of The Myth of Left and Right don't just leave us hanging with a bleak diagnosis.
They actually offer some pretty concrete solutions.
Oh, good. I was hoping they wouldn't just doom and gloom us. So what's the antidote to all this left-right tribalism? What do they suggest?
Well, one of the key strategies they propose is something they call granularity.
Granularity. That sounds kind of technical.
It is, but it's also a really simple idea. It basically means focusing on specific issues and policies rather than these broad, overarching labels of left and right.
Oh, so instead of just saying, I'm a liberal or I'm a conservative, you might say, I support universal health care, but I also think we need to reduce the national debt. Or, I'm pro-choice, but I also believe in strong border security.
Exactly. You're acknowledging that you might hold views that fall on different points along the traditional left-right spectrum.
It's like you're creating your own personalized political compass based on your own values and beliefs, rather than just accepting the prepackaged version that everyone else is using.
It's about owning your own beliefs.
I like that.
And it allows for more nuance and complexity in our political conversations.
Right, because the world isn't black and white. There are so many shades of gray.
And it opens up the possibility for finding common ground with people who might seem, at first glance, like they're on the opposite side of the spectrum.
You know, that actually reminds me of something I've been struggling with lately. Like, I'll be having a conversation with someone, and they'll say something about, being pro this or anti that. And I'll realize, like, I don't even know what that means anymore.
Because the labels have become so loaded.
Yeah. It's like, what does it even mean to be pro-choice or pro-life in 2024? Those terms have become so oversimplified, so weaponized, that they've lost all meaning.
It's like we're all speaking different languages, even though we're using the same words.
It's so frustrating.
Yeah.
And it makes it almost impossible to have a productive conversation because you're constantly having to define your terms and unpack all this baggage that comes with these labels.
It's exhausting.
It really is. So this
Yeah.
idea of granularity, it's like a breath of fresh air. It's like, let's just hit the reset button and start talking about specific policies, specific issues, without all this ideological baggage weighing us down.
Exactly. It's about getting back to the substance of the debate rather than getting caught up in these symbolic battles over labels and categories.
So that's granularity. What else do they suggest?
Another key strategy is finding what they call healthier tribes.
Healthier tribes. I like the sound of that.
Me too. It's basically the idea that we all have this innate need to belong, to be part of a group. But they argue that we don't have to limit ourselves to tribes based solely on political affiliation.
Right, because those can get pretty toxic, as we've been discussing.
Exactly. So instead of just hanging out with people who agree with us politically, they encourage us to seek out communities based on shared interests, values, hobbies, or experiences.
Like, I'm a huge fan of board games, right? So I could join a board game club, and I'd probably meet people from all walks of life, all different political persuasions, but we'd be united by our love of Settlers of Catan or whatever.
Exactly. And those shared interests can form the basis for genuine connection and friendship, even if you disagree on certain political issues.
It's like we're all human beings first and foremost. We all have things that we're passionate about, things that bring us joy, things that connect us to others.
And those connections can be so much more powerful than our political differences.
It's like we can still be friends, even if we don't agree on who to vote for.
Exactly. And the book argues that these healthier tribes can actually be really good for our mental and emotional well-being.
Oh, how so?
Well, for one thing, they provide us with a sense of belonging and community, which is essential for human flourishing.
Right, we're social creatures.
Yeah.
We need to feel connected to others.
Exactly. And when those connections are based on something deeper than just political affiliation, they can be much more resilient, much more supportive.
It's like you're not going to lose a friend just because you disagree on tax policy.
Exactly. And these healthier tribes can also help us broaden our horizons and expose us to new ideas and perspectives.
It's like that saying, if you're the smartest person in the room, you're in the wrong room.
Right. And when we surround ourselves with people who are different from us, who challenge our assumptions and make us think in new ways, we grow as individuals.
It's like our world expands. We start to see the world through different lenses.
Exactly. And that can be a really enriching experience.
Okay, so we've got granularity and healthier tribes. What's a third strategy they suggest?
This one might sound a little counterintuitive, but it's called adversarial collaboration.
Adversarial collaboration. It sounds like an oxymoron.
I know, right? But it's actually a really powerful concept.
So what is it?
It's essentially about seeking out people who disagree with you and engaging in respectful debate with the goal of learning and growing.
So it's not about trying to win the argument or convert the other person to your way of thinking.
Not at all. It's about approaching the conversation with humility, with a genuine desire to understand the other person's perspective.
It's like you're both on the same team, even though you have different ideas about how to achieve the goal.
Exactly. And the book argues that this kind of adversarial collaboration can actually lead to more creative and innovative solutions.
Because you're bringing different perspectives to the table, you're challenging each other's assumptions, and you're forcing each other to think outside the box.
Right. And it's not always easy, but it can be incredibly rewarding.
I bet. It takes a lot of courage and open-mindedness to engage with someone who sees the world so differently from you.
It does, but it also takes a lot of respect.
Respect for the other person, respect for their ideas, even if you disagree with them.
And respect for the process of dialogue itself, because it's through dialogue that we can bridge divides, find common ground, and ultimately build a better world.
Well said. I'm really struck by this idea that we don't have to choose between being true to our beliefs and being open to other perspectives.
Right. It's not an either-or proposition. We can hold our own convictions strongly while also being willing to listen to and learn from those who see things differently.
And in fact, the authors argue that it's by embracing this both-hand approach that we can actually strengthen our own beliefs.
Because when we're willing to engage with opposing viewpoints, we're forced to examine our own assumptions, to think more critically about our own positions.
And that can lead to a deeper, more nuanced understanding of the issues.
Exactly. So it's not about watering down our beliefs or compromising our values. It's about enriching them, expanding them, making them more robust.
It's like we're not afraid to test our ideas in the marketplace of ideas.
Exactly. And we're confident that our ideas can stand up to scrutiny.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the myth of left and right, I'm left with this sense of hope.
Hope.
Yeah, because the book doesn't just diagnose the problem. It offers real, practical solutions.
And it reminds us that we have the power to change the way we engage with each other, to move beyond this toxic left-right paradigm, and to create a more constructive and compassionate political landscape.
And it all starts with each one of us.
With the choices we make every day. How we talk to each other, how we listen to each other, and how we choose to engage with those who see the world differently from us.
So if you're listening and you're feeling disillusioned by the state of our political discourse, I urge you to check out The Myth of Left and Right by Verlan and Hyrum Lewis. It's a thought-provoking and ultimately hopeful book that offers a path forward.
And who knows, maybe it'll even inspire you to start some adversarial collaborations of your own.
That's a great idea. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive, and until next time, keep those conversations flowing.